1916. A national liberation uprising is now taking place in Kazakhstan. It broke out in response to the Tsar's order during World War I, mobilizing all the nation's male citizens for rare labor. Actually, that was the cause. The contradictions and issues that led to the Kazakhs' rebellion were far more intricate and profound. The Russian Empire, which included Kazakhstan, entered World War I and experienced economic collapse. This led to a severe decline in the standard of living for the general populace. In Russia itself, the peasantry found itself below the poverty line. Workers in factories also raised protests and organized strikes because they worked 16 hours a day for pennies in unbearable conditions. Huge quantities of livestock were exported from the Kazakh steppes for next to nothing. Lands were forcibly confiscated and taxes became unaffordable. And the call to the front was the last straw. The uprising covered all of Kazakhstan, Central Asia, part of Siberia, and the Caucasus. Amangildy Imanov commanded the rebel movement in Turgai, which developed into a particularly powerful center of resistance. Under the direction of Alikhan Bokikhan, the leaders of the Kazakh intelligentsia urged the population to embrace a strategy of reasonable compromise, fully aware that there would be many casualties and bloodshed, and that the average person would not be able to withstand a skilled and well-trained army for very long. And so it happened. To put an end to the revolt, strong forces were sent in, a whole punitive corps under General Lavrentyev's command. As a result, the uprising was brutally suppressed. Dozens of villages were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. Many fled outside Kazakhstan to save their lives. This uprising was suppressed, but it was no longer possible to save the dying empire, and the Bolshevik movement a year later in 1917 would put an end to the history of the Russian monarchy. The autocracy was overthrown, but will this bring well-being and prosperity to Russia or Kazakhstan? In 1917, no one knew the answer to this question. The only goal was to endure the passage of time, to live, and to protect the nation, its territory and its citizens. Furthermore, it is hard to overstate the significance and role played by the heads of the Kazakh intelligentsia at this time. They negotiated with the Whites and the Reds in an effort to secure the best possible position for the nation. And it was they who established the first Kazakh autonomy, a plan for the country's continued growth. They are the ones who will have to pay a price for their beliefs and morals. And these names, Alikhan, Ahmed, Mirjakip, Makhjan, Mustafa, will come to symbolize patriotism. But I want to tell you Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev's story today, friends. The first railway engineer and prime minister of the Turkestan autonomy tragically passed away during the years of extreme terror, despite having greatly contributed to Kazakhstan's independence.
To His Excellency, the Supreme Ruler Admiral Alexander Kolchak. A Kyrgyz revolt occurred in early August of 1916 as a result of conscription for frontline labor. Tashkent, Fergana, and Semipalatinsk insurgents were the targets of punitive detachments. Following 2 months of warfare, the rebels retreated over the cold mountains to the Chinese provinces in October, following by punitive detachments including almost 200,000 people of both genders. Defeated by punitive detachments, deprived of most of their livestock and property, the unorganized masses of the Kyrgyz, upon arriving at new places, scattered in different directions and very soon became victims to the indigenous population. Famine broke out among refugees in the winter of 1916-1917. They began to sell their wives and children. Typhus spread among the refugees in February and March 1917.
Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev wrote this letter to Kolchak. In it, he explains all of the difficulties that the Kazakhs faced during the 1916 revolt and requests amnesty and financial support for them. The temporary government did nothing in response to the letter, and this was one of those occasions when it became clear that despite its new shape, the content and core of Russian state policy against the Kazakhs remained unchanged. Furthermore, the interim government's uncertainty strengthens the Bolsheviks' power on the empire's fringes. Kazakh politicians make their own decisions based on the present scenario.
Оценивая сложившуюся ситуацию, казахские политики выбирают свой путь.
Дело в том, что мы очень часто говорим о голоде.
The reality is that we frequently discuss famines in the 1920s and the 1930s. However, according to inaccurate data, more than 100,000 people died on Kazakhstan's territory in 1916 as a result of starvation. And Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev mentioned this in his reports and demonstrations against the Kerensky regime. And it was exactly via his letter and strong persuasion that Kerensky traveled to Kazakhstan and first-hand witnessed the horrible living circumstances of the Kazakhs who were poor.
Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev has been involved in solving issues important to the population since childhood. His father was the B, judge of the Zhetysu region, was a member of the land committee, defended the interests of the Kazakh people all his life and taught his son the same. Hope and support for the entire family, the boy was smart and inquisitive from childhood, so his father sent him to study at the Verny's men's gymnasium, famous educational institution in Zhetysu. Young Tynyshbayev graduated from high school with a gold medal and decided to continue his studies in St. Petersburg State Transport University of Emperor Alexander I.
From the appeal of the Verny gymnasium director, Vakrushev. Student Tynyshbayev is in all respects an exemplary student and moreover of outstanding ability, and therefore I consider it my duty to earnestly ask Your Excellency to provide a scholarship to Tynyshbayev, without which he will not be able to continue his education at a higher educational institution.
The end of the 19th and early 20th centuries saw a global railway boom. The railway track, which first emerged in England in the 18th century, had spread around the world by the beginning of the 19th century. Everyone flocked to trains and travel, notably the Orient Express, which ran through Europe's capitals. Everyone from royalty to film and music stars wished to board the legendary train and travel in its snug cabins. In Russia, there was also a rail boom. Private businesses were contracted to construct railways. The proceeds from the sale of Alaska were used to establish a special fund that provided loans for railway development. Bridges were also erected over big rivers. In general, the profession of a railway engineer was extremely promising and in demand.
The railway direction at that time, at the turn of the century, the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, was on the verge of fantasy. The renowned science fiction author Jules Verne published the book Claudius Bombarnac because it was such an amazing idea. In the book, he described the construction of roads to Central Asia. This was the dream of Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev. Now people build railways, infrastructure, and at that time it was, of course, unrealistic. But Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev carried it out. Not only did he dream, he not only received the profession of a railway worker, but he built railways both in Kazakhstan and in Central Asia.
Но он строил железные дороги не только в Казахстане, но и в Азии, в Средней Азии.
When young Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev arrives in St. Petersburg for the first time in 1900, he embarks on a completely new life. He sees that dissatisfaction with the current government has reached its peak not only in Kazakhstan. Everyone in Russia was talking about the need for radical reforms. In times of political crisis, different political groups and circles convened in covert meetings, and new acts of revolutionary terrorism broke out. The events of Bloody Sunday on January 9, 1905, served as the catalyst for the upsurge in violence. And in the same year, a young student, Tynyshbayev, writes a letter addressed to Sergei Witte, the chairman of the Russian Empire's Council of Ministers, in which he reports on the plight of the local Kazakhs, who are literally being driven out of their own land by the local administration.
80-90 years have passed since our grandfathers and fathers entered into Russian citizenship. Even earlier, the Kyrgyz living in the Ural, Turgai and Akmola regions joined Russia. Throughout this period, the highest charters, decrees and so forth were consistently issued. These eventually served as a foundation for the regulations governing the administration of the Kyrgyz territories. The practice of managing the Kyrgyz population has shown that certain articles of the current temporary regulations may be quite consistent with the spirit of the past, but do not meet the living conditions of the Kyrgyz people at the present time. Life itself raises a number of serious issues affecting the pressing needs and interests of the Kyrgyz people. There were so many examples when the Kyrgyz suffered innocently, only because the authorities did not know the Kyrgyz language at all, and the translators were either bribed or simply, out of ignorance, translated incorrectly.
This
letter is clear evidence of the life position of young Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev. He was truly patriotic. He could enjoy life in St. Petersburg, dance at balls and drink champagne, but he thinks about the fate of his powerless people. Despite his young age, at heart he's very mature and conscious. In 1907, Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev with Alikhan Bokikhanov, Ahmed Birimzhanov, Shaimirden Koshigulov and Bakhtchan Karatayev got the opportunity to raise issues of concern to the Kazakhs as deputies. After the dissolution of the First State Duma by Emperor Nicholas II, they were elected members of the State Duma for the second convocation. Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev was only 28 years old. Then, from the rostrum of the representative legislative body, he, along with other Kazakh deputies, actively defends the interests of his people and his native land. However, the Second Duma also did not last long. On June 3rd of the same year, it was dissolved.
I would like to draw attention to what he did in the State Duma. Together with other deputies, Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev raised questions concerning how to link Kazakh national interests with imperial, national and pro-Russian goals. This is a very difficult question, because an empire always has a titular nation, a dominion nation, and there is politics. Russia, after all, was not a highly developed state, either industrially or socio-economically. But I once said in one of my interviews, to my surprise, that Russia had quite good higher education in a number of cities, including St. Petersburg. The Russian Empire itself, without suspecting it, perhaps understanding it, raised the future intelligentsia from the people of the Kazakh steppe, giving them an excellent education, first in gymnasiums, various lyceums, schools, and subsequently in universities. Therefore, Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev raises the question of how to combine imperial national interests, and he raises this issue in the State Duma. But at the same time, how not to forget about the interests of the Kazakh national ones. What are these national issues? First of all, preserve the maximum territories of the Kazakhs. Try to reach the level of creating some kind of political unification, because the Russian Empire was a motley large state association with different levels of development of state political processes, both at the urban level, at the level of large cities, and at the level of outskirts, including, let's say, colonial ones. Naturally, these issues could not just pass. Therefore, Stolypin and the entire reactionary elite of the Russian political establishment decided to disperse the State Duma after 3 months, because deputies raised not only issues of the development of the Russian Empire, but also new positionings of national outskirts.
Mukhamedjan
Tynyshbayev did such a great job that in those years he was still in interaction, and the Tsarist administration listened to personalities like Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev. Thanks to him, field trials were abolished. There were field courts, similar to NKVD Troika or Special Troika in Soviet history during the 30s, when they gathered and shot. The nomadic population was mostly targeted for shooting. They were suspected of livestock theft, and numerous causes were discovered. Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev performed an excellent job. He was involved in the development of railways and highways both in Kazakhstan and in Tashkent, Jetysu.
The Kazakh community in St. Petersburg was strong. In this photo, there are Kazakh students. Gulsuma Sfindiarova, Sanjara Sfindyarov's older sister, stands to Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev's left. Young Khalil Dusmuhamedov is also here, as is Sadwakas Shalimbekov, a student at the Imperial Military Medical Academy and cousin of Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev's future wife, a lovely Gulbahram Shalimbekova. Gulbahram was the daughter of the famous doctor Baki Shalimbekov. Educated and beautiful, in her free time she was involved in charity work, organizing exhibitions and auctions for wealthy people, the proceeds from which she donated to funds for the poor. They met at one of such charity evenings. Mukhamedjan immediately announced his serious intentions regarding Gulbahram. It was a happy, understanding and supportive marriage. In 1909, Mukhamedjan and Gulbahram had their first child, a son, Iskander, and then 2 daughters, Fatima and Dina. After completing his studies in St. Petersburg, Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev begins his professional activities and goes on an expedition to study the route of the future Turkestan-Siberian Railway. After the uprising in 1916 and the 1917 revolution, Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev became Prime Minister of the Turkestan autonomy, which had a population of almost 5 million people.
Туркестанской автономии с населением более чем в 5 миллионов человек.
When we describe the political history of Central Asia, not taking into account only Kazakhstan, we clearly see that there were no leaders from among the Uzbek, Tajik or Turkmen people. This does not mean at all that they did not exist. They were mainly the leaders of the Basmachi movements, which came out against Soviet power. However, Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev was actively involved in politics during the time of political disengagement, the fall of the Russian Empire and the Civil War. All of this, nevertheless, seems to have been decided upon in consultation with Alikhan Bukhayanov, the leader of the Alash movement. The fact is that the creation of Turkestan autonomy, I still insist, not Kokand, but Turkestan, because it went beyond the borders of Kokand. Kokand is a city. When we give a political assessment, let's say the emergence of a state on the territory of modern Uzbekistan, the policy approach is very clearly suitable there, like Greece, city-states, Kokand, Khiva, Samarkand. These are the former emirates. But the large number of not the Uzbek population, but rather the Kazakh population in these territories suggested that it was necessary to defend, among other things, the interests of the Kazakh population. In addition, the leaders of Alash Orda were not reactionary nationalists. That is, even when they created the Alash Orda government, the Provisional Council, they left around 10 ministerial seats for people of other ethnicities, non-Kazakhs. In other words, this is a clear sign that these were still liberal viewpoints.
Показатель того, что это все же были взгляды и либерального характера.
Ну, конечно,
Naturally, no government will permit the establishment of another. It was precisely Turkestan and Kokand that was awakening. The concept of independence and freedom was reawakened. The Kokand autonomy stands at the origins of the establishment of Uzbekistan.
автономия, да, даже своя, она стоит у истоков вот организации того же Узбекистана. Она даже дала вот это нашему...
It even contributed to our Alash movement. Imagine a time when people who had spent many centuries as colonies decided to establish their own state, authority, leadership, power structures, and state institutions. Naturally, this leads to rejection by those in positions of authority. Thus, it was brutally put down.
неприятие, и поэтому она была жестоко подавлена.
Yes, the defeat of the Turkestan autonomy and the dispersal of its government became one of the most tragic pages of our history. The Bolsheviks almost completely destroyed Kokand. The city vanished without a trace in 3 days, and after that, Red Army units and Dashnak Sutun gangs cleaned the streets of the city. At least 10,000 people were killed by punitive soldiers in Kokand. Turkestan's autonomy lasted just 3 months. Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev survived and played an active role in the Alash autonomy movement. Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev became Alikhan Bokikhanov's right hand, training the Alash cavalry combat detachments. It was a challenging moment of looking for allies and determining their own path. Alash Orda negotiated with both the whites and the reds, trying to choose the lesser of two evils. Finally, the Bolsheviks prevailed. Furthermore, Lenin stated that nations have the right to self-determination and pledged an amnesty to any ideological opponents who supported Soviet rule. Oraz Jandosov, who led the communist detachments, and Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev knew each other for a long time. Tynyshbayev once helped Jandosov while he was attending the regional gymnasium. Therefore, thanks to good relations and diplomatic talks, the Alash detachments peacefully joined the Bolsheviks without firing a single shot. As a result, thousands of lives of Kazakh soldiers on both sides were saved. Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev's fate took a sad turn in 1922. He works actively first in Tashkent as the head of the Water Management Department of the People's Commissariat of Agriculture of the Turkestan territory, and then travels to Shymkent, while simultaneously conducting reconnaissance activities on the project for the construction of the Turkestan Irrigation Canal.
They moved, and he often took his eldest son, Iskander, with him on trips. And it turns out that later he said, "My son, I leave you only my books and bridges, crossings, roads, as an inheritance." That is, this is a man who left behind not only the legacy of his children, but a wonderful railway that is still in use today. He was the first in Central Asia, in this region, to develop a drainage system under railways, where a railway could not be built in theory due to the technologies of the time. He effectively dealt with it by developing a new drainage system that was rather simple, primitive, and quite effective, which none of the Tsarist engineers had ever considered at the time. But I think the question is not that he was somehow super unique. He simply approached these matters responsibly. He was a very responsible and highly qualified specialist. Naturally, the Soviet government could not just say goodbye to such people.
He is constantly on business trips. Meanwhile, a terrible cholera epidemic has broken out in the country's south, and Tynyshbayev's wife, Gulbahram, does her civic duty by visiting hospitals, treating patients and assisting others. But the insidious disease did not spare the woman. She became infected and died in a couple of days, leaving Mukhamedjan without time to say farewell to his sweetheart. And when he returned from a business trip with his son Iskander, a fire was already burning out in their home's courtyard, in which, along with other cholera victims, his beloved wife and mother of his children's body was burnt.
«22 июня 22 года Она погибла.
On June 22nd, she died. There was an outbreak of cholera, and she, as a health worker, went to save people during cholera. Of course, as a physician, as an educated person, she knew very well what cholera was, how people were infected. She knew perfectly how this could end. She became infected and died quickly, fell ill and died instantly.
Она прекрасно знала, чем это может закончиться. Она заразилась и скоропалительно умерла, заболела и моментально умерла. Жена такого знаменитого человека.
The wife of such a famous person as Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev, who was an engineer, prime minister of the Kokand government, second person in Alash Orda, she could sit at home or leave somewhere. Being a mother of 3 children, she went to fulfill her civic duty.
Матерью 3 детей она пошла, она выполняла свой гражданский долг. Они были правильными людьми.
They were good people, educated, cultured, and patriots, and she went to look after ordinary sick people who were suffering from cholera, and quickly she fell ill and died.
Заболели холерой, и скоропалительно она заболела, заразилась и умерла. В то время Mukhamedjan.
At that time, Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev, with my father Iskander, were on an expedition to survey the territory along which the railway was supposed to go, because Dad was always next to his father. And when they arrived, the corpses, doused with acid, were already burning out.
Они приехали, трупы, облитые кислотой, уже догорали. Вот эта красавица, юная, можно сказать.
This beauty, a young woman, a mother of 3 children, and the favorite muse of Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev, was already burning out in the fire with all those who died from this cholera.
Умершими от этой холеры.
It was a terrible tragedy for Mukhamedjan and for little children. Dad was 11 years old and the girls were even younger. One was 8, the other was 5. Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev was left with 3 children.
Остался с 3 детьми, малолетками, остался на руках. Они жили вчетвером.
He was left alone with them, but did everything so that the children would not feel orphaned. He spent all free time with them, cooking, cleaning, and doing laundry.
Я помню, как папа мне рассказывал, что они очень-очень долго жили все вчетвером.
I remember my dad told me that the 4 of them lived together for a very long time. As he wrote, Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev was both mom and dad for them. That is, he cleaned, ironed, and made lunches. He braided the girls' hair and cooked dinner, and did homework with them.
Вот эта семья, на нем вся была семья. Это учесть то, что человек был общественный деятель.
Although he was a public figure, a historian, an engineer, a prospector, the entire burden of living with 3 small children fell on his shoulders.
Быта с 3 маленькими детьми вся легла на его плечи.
Политический лидер, экономический деятель.
A political leader, an economic figure, a major industrialist on the scale of the Soviet Union, is unexpectedly left alone without his beloved lady. Her relatives and friends described her as someone with strong convictions. They had a strong affection for one another, and not only as husband and wife. Apparently, they had deep feelings and a wonderful family, and this was a personal tragedy which not every man can endure with dignity. And then there are his children. Of course, he was not alone in this trouble, and this probably saved him, because during those years nearly every family struggled. However, he had to balance high-level government roles and business visits with the family. That difficult period showed us that Tynyshbayev was still a wonderful father, a parent of his children, a wonderful husband, a man who was able to overcome problems with his will. Though they did not end in his life, they continued to increase.
He went to work at the Institute of Public Education. He taught mathematics and physics to students, and in his free time he studied history. He wrote the first history of the Kazakhs. It also focuses on genealogy and the Kazakhs' origins. Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev was the first historian to confirm that the study of ethnicity should begin with shizhire, the practice of tracing and documenting one's family lineage or genealogy.
Занимался активно написанием исторической литературы.
He was actively involved in writing historical literature, notably works on the history of the Kyrgyz Kazakh people. There are a number of other applied works there. However, I believe it is an exceptional piece of art, because we are not yet good historians in Kazakh genealogy. Many historians nowadays have reached the point of mythologizing tribal history, while Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev was well versed in Arabic in addition to a European foreign language. He knew the Chagatai language, so he could read manuscripts. He published a lot about genealogy, including a solid monograph that later became a reference book for many historians studying Kazakh and Turkic ancestry.
Была настольной книгой многих специалистов-историков по казахской, тюркской генеалогии.
1927, Deputy Chairman of the Council of the People's Commissars of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic Turar Raskulov personally invites Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev to work on the largest project of the first five-year plan, Turkestan-Siberian Railway, the Steel Path, a 1,442-kilometer railway that was supposed to connect Central Asia and Siberia. Raskulov knows what he's doing. He knows what experience and scientific knowledge Tynyshbayev has, and despite the protests of many party colleagues, he invites Tynyshbayev to take an active part in the construction of this project.
In the first years of Soviet power, the government treated the outstanding figures of Alasharda not only condescendingly, but with maximum use of the potential of these people, because there was simply no people who knew the region. There were no highly qualified specialists. Not everyone wanted to go to this region. In addition, the Soviet government very strictly controlled the implementation of those party tasks. And accordingly, no one wanted to take risks, and Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev is a very responsible person. He never had any mistakes. Even today we know that in Almaty there are railway stations, Almaty 1 and Almaty 2. Why did Almaty 2 appear? The fact is that Almaty 1 was initially designed incorrectly. And when it was designed, Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev, already in the Soviet period, he openly said about this, corrected all the mistakes, and subsequently said that it was necessary to build another station for the Almaty 2 railway, which would be more efficient and correct, taking into account seismic resistance of this region. Imagine the level of an expert who can freely state this. Naturally, he was a straightforward, principled individual. And it is understandable because during that time in Central Asia, you could count the number of educated individuals on your fingers. Turar Raskulov, as a deputy representative of the Council of People's Commissars, knew Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev. He suggested him, because Tynyshbayev, a railway specialist, was the best option. And of course, they were against him. They were against his past, that he was from a wealthy, prosperous family. Despite this, Turar Raskulov nominated him for this position.
И несмотря на это, Турар Расколов, он его выдвинул на эту должность.
A home near the crossroads of Panfilov and Tolibi streets in the heart of Almaty, Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev spent those years residing in this home. He left this entryway every morning to go to work, come back in the evening and put the kids to bed, and went to his office to work. By the way, thanks to Tynyshbayev's proposals, it was possible to save 25 million rubles on the construction of Turksib and reduce the construction period by almost a year. These are unique archival newsreels. April 28, 1930. Construction of the Turksib is completed. Chairman of the Turksib Construction Committee Turar Raskulov personally awards the railway builders. You won't see Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev in this video, just like in this photo capturing the head of Turkcib, Vladimir Shatov, while hammering in the last spike of the highway. And here, Philip Golishchekin stands, and behind him is a young man, his face obscured. But this is none other than Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev's son, the first Kazakh cameraman, Iskander Tynyshbayev. At this historical period, on April 28, 1930, he filmed his debut work, The Bow of Turkcib. Tynyshbayev Sr. will not see the film's premiere. He will be arrested by NKVD officers 3 months later, in August of that year. In the early 1930s, mass repressions had not yet commenced and the murderous Stalinist machine was only getting started. Therefore, Tynyshbayev and a number of other Kazakh intellectual leaders were condemned, but not executed, and forced into exile in Voronezh.
By
the time of this arrest, Tynyshbayev was married for the second time. His wife, Amina Sheikh Ali, will follow her husband into exile. While in captivity, Tynyshbayev learns that he had another son, Davlet. To protect the child from possible problems, he writes a letter to his wife, in which he asks to register the baby under her last name, Sheikh Ali. Tynyshbayev's fears and anxieties were well-founded, since his eldest son, Iskander, was arrested immediately after he went to visit his father in exile. So this is what happened when Mukhamedjan was exiled in 1932 to Voronezh. It is clear what exiles in Voronezh looked like. They were already starving there. The 30s were the hardest time. He already had a little son. He had a new wife. It seems they only got married in 1930. So a little son was born. My father had already graduated from the Russian State University of Cinematography. He was a cinematographer and worked well with the camera. Dad earned good money, so he saved money and went to Voronezh to visit his father. He adjusted his life, bought a house and a cow. After having visited his father, he arrived in Almaty and was called to the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, NKVD, and was told that he was traveling as a messenger of the Alash Orda.
From the memories of Iskander Tynyshbayev. Well-wishers taught me not to go to Voronezh, and in general for a while, forget that I have a father. They gave me work, paid me well for films, and constantly emphasized that a son is not responsible for his father. And I said, I'm responsible for him. I want to be responsible for my father. I vouch for his every action, for every word he said.
There is so much pain and pride for the father in these words. He did not renounce him no matter what. During the interrogation, the investigator repeatedly allowed himself to speak about Mukhamedjan in a derogatory manner. Iskander could not stand this, and he responded to the insult like a man. As a result, he was convicted and sentenced to death, which was later replaced by 10 years in the camps.
This is the
Gulag system. This is hard labor. Dad faced execution, he wore shackles, and later he had scars from them. Imagine he was waiting for the execution. They could have done it at any time, and then they replaced it with 10 years of hard labor. Dad was always collected, and I was even afraid to approach and wake him when he was asleep. Because he jumped off with horror in his eyes. Can you imagine? He was waiting for death. He knew that they could come at any moment. Someone says it is not so scary, but every person is afraid to die, that's all. Everyone has a built-in feeling, the fear of death.
Каждый человек боится умирать. Это все вот не надо. У каждого есть заложенное чувство, страх смерти.
Tynyshbayev moved to Tashkent after completing the mandatory 5 years of exile. Going back to Almaty was outright forbidden. He was slandered and persecuted while living his final years away from his native country. When they discovered that he was detained due to a political offense, people decided not to hire him. An encyclopedic knowledge possessor could serve the nation and its citizens far more, but he would have to live in poverty and work odd jobs. But Tynyshbayev's spirit remained unbroken in spite of the challenging circumstances. He continued to be a calm, noble, and compassionate person. Davlet, his youngest son, who also spent his entire life abroad, recalled him in this way.
He said, "Repeat after me. I will be an engineer." Repeat. Then he said, "Alma-Ata is my homeland." And that's how he talked to me every day.
Со мной разговаривал. Каждый день он приходил. Причем это же самое мне говорила мама.
And my mother told me the same thing. At the same time, she took me around the city and showed me trains and railways.
По городу и показывала поезда, железные дороги. И на железной дороге говорила, вот это поезд. Ну, мы когда уже приехали из ссылки в Ташкент, в Алмату нас не пустили.
When we arrived from Tashkent exile, they did not let us into Almaty. He was looking for work. He found it in the construction of the Kunde-Aghash-Guriev railway.
Я заболел там на дороге, и был серьезной болезнью детской, и тогда меня поместили.
I suffered a bad childhood sickness, and my parents transported me to a hospital near Issyk-Kul Lake.
Мама там осталась жить недалеко. Мне удалось выжить.
My mother stayed nearby, and I survived, owing to an excellent doctor. A lot of children died during that time. Then I was taken to Ufa.
Очень много детей гибло. Меня привезли уже в Уфу.
Davlet Sheikh Ali lives in America with his daughter and granddaughter. Like his father, he devoted his entire life to science and became an engineer. After his father was repressed, Davlet remained in Bashkortostan in Ufa. There he got an education, defended his PhD dissertation, and married. And now he's gone to join his children in the United States. But he tries to come to Kazakhstan while he still has the strength. After all, in the brief time he and his father spent together, Tynyshbayev instilled in his son an interest in the profession as well as love for his own nation. Tynyshbayev had nearly reached the age of 60 when he was detained again in November 1937. He was sick and exhausted, posed no threat to the present regime, and was detained again. The charges remained the same. Tynyshbayev never disputed being a member of the Alash movement or actively participating in espionage and attempts to subvert the Soviet state.
Я вам хочу сказать, что у руководства Советского Союза
The Soviet Union's leadership experienced a revolution in the first half of its existence, and in the second, it seemed as though paranoia had set in, because the Soviet Union as a whole was repressed there, not only the Kazakhs. Kazakhstan thus paid a heavy price to establish its own sovereignty through this blood.
И вот она создала свое государство. И поэтому я хочу сказать, что вот Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev, вот Ahmed Brimjanov,
The lives of Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev, Ahmed Baitursunov, Ahmed Brimjanov, and the entire Kazakh intelligentsia was sacrificed. Alikhan Bakikhanov, Saken Seyfulin, Tynyshbayev, Turar Raskulov, and Sultanbek Khojanov lived for one idea. Their lives were not lived for themselves.
Они жили ради одной идеи. Они ради себя свою жизнь не посвятили. Они посвятили жизнь процветанию казахской нации, казахского государства. И поэтому надо свысока смотреть.
They committed their entire lives to ensuring the prosperity of the state and people of Kazakhstan.
Давать характеристики, это они свою жизнь отдали. И то, что мы сейчас живем,
We are also reaping the benefits of their labor because we are alive. They honorably performed their duty to the motherland.
на этом этапе они с честью выполнили свой долг перед Родиной.
Они были едины в одном, что нужно создавать максимальное...
They all agreed on the necessity of establishing the best possible environment for life. All of Allah's leaders, however, notably Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev, were not reactionary nationalists. In other words, they held liberal beliefs regarding the freedom of different ethnic groups within Kazakhstan. In an era of numerous wars and ethnic, political, international, and continental disputes, this is highly captivating and incredibly relevant in the context and tendencies of the modern democracies worldwide. Furthermore, I find myself thinking that we have lost perhaps one of the most notable political personalities in world history. The existence of such individuals in Kazakhstan is just astounding.
истории. Просто удивительно, что такие люди были в Казахстане.
He will no longer leave the NKVD jails, and the reasons for his death will remain unclear. According to the official version, he was shot in a Tashkent prison. This is confirmed by the investigation materials and the verdict. However, historians have discovered medical documents, in particular, the death certificate of Tynyshbayev, in which the cause of death is indicated as a serious illness.
Вот как историк, архивист, я...
This is what I would like to say here. As a historian-archivist, I came across a number of documents related not to Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev, but to other executed individuals. And as a rule, when a sentence is passed, it is already a judicial decision of punishment. But there was also an execution list, that is, a fact confirming the execution of the sentence. I didn't find this sheet, at least I didn't come across it, although there is a note in the journal that he was shot, absolutely right, in Tashkent, but there is evidence that he died somewhere in exile. This remained a secret.
Тоже тайна.
Mukhamedjan Tynyshbayev is a unique personality in our history. He left behind not only an intellectual, but also a material legacy that has served the people for many years. His personality amazingly intertwined the best human qualities, professionalism, a responsible approach to any business, a broad outlook, intelligence. He was a wonderful husband and father who, despite high government positions and difficult tasks, never forgot about his children, raising them as worthy people and patriots. People like Tynyshbayev are the golden gene pool of any nation. Following the path of Tynyshbayev means following the path of creation, development, and justice. This means leaving behind not only an imaginary, but a true mark, which after many years and decades will benefit the country and the people.